Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined once again by James Meadway. Very nice to see you twice within 7 days or 4 days or something like that. This is great, James.
Yeah, it's something of a record. It's a sort of low bar for a record, but yeah, it's a bit of a first for us, isn't it?
I never thought I'd see you more than twice in 4 days, James, but now it's happened. Coming up later tonight, will capital gains tax go up under a Labour government? Rishi Sunak's BBC interviewed showed a man who seems to have accepted defeat, and Israel and Hamas have responded to the UN Security Council voting for a ceasefire proposal in Gaza, although we still don't have much clarity. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has today presented his party's big ideas to the nation with the launch of the Conservatives' election manifesto. The party is 20 points behind in the polls, so as you'd expect, there were some hefty giveaways, including this.
Our national insurance tax cuts are already worth £900 to the average worker. And we will keep cutting taxes in the coming years, meaning that by 2027, we will have halved national insurance to 6%. That is a tax cut, my friends, worth £1,300 to the average worker, making more progress towards our long-term ambition to abolish the double taxation on work when it is economically responsible to do so. Now, I also want to say something about the self-employed, because they're the risk takers, the people who graft hard to make a living, who get our economy growing. They embody the most conservative of values, the desire to build something, to create wealth and opportunity. But setting up on your own means you don't have the same security that those on payroll do. So it must be worth taking that risk. We need to make it worth taking that risk. And that means that their taxes must be cut. So, in the next Parliament, we will scrap entirely the main rate of self-employed national insurance.
So you got lower national insurance for employees and national insurance scrapped for the self-employed. So after a campaign mainly pitched at pensioners, Sunak is clearly trying to win back at least a sliver of the working age population. To that end, Sunak also offered some tax cuts for people trying to get on the property ladder.
For young families, for the first-time buyers purchasing a home up to £425,000, we will abolish stamp duty entirely. And that's not all we'll do. We'll also introduce a new form of Help to Buy, a new Help to Buy scheme to get a new generation onto the property ladder, all part of our plan to build an ownership society where more and more people have the security and pride that comes from owning your own home. From Macmillan to Thatcher to today, it is we Conservatives who are the party of the property-owning democracy in this country.
The Conservatives, I think, here have very belatedly realised that the housing crisis has meant that no one's really been able to become a property owner, and that meant that you haven't created any future Conservatives. I think there are a number of reasons why actually people buying property won't necessarily make them into Tories in the same way that it might have done in the past. But a sort of a standard lifetime transition that people have been known to make is sort of as you get older, you buy a property, you start a family, you start becoming a little bit more conservative in some of your attitudes and priorities. And because no one can buy a house, that hasn't happened. So Rishi Sunak's just about to lose power after 14 years, and now he's going, oh God, if only we'd let more people buy homes. Obviously, this kind of demand-side reform where you sort of say we're going to make it easier to get a mortgage, it's only really going to help a very small sliver of people anyway, because he says loads of people can afford the mortgage payments, they just can't afford the deposit. In fact, I mean, a hell of a lot of people, I would say probably most people who aren't on the property ladder couldn't afford the mortgage repayments at the moment on the wages as they currently are, and with house prices as high as they currently are. Other tax cuts offered by Sunak included capital gains relief for landlords. Now, this sounds like the craziest policy ever. We're going to do a tax cut for landlords. That's what it was on the front of the Daily Telegraph. In fact, this seems to be to try and incentivize landlords to sell their properties to tenants, so they won't get charged capital gains tax if they sell their property to tenants. The pension triple lock, well, it's now become a quadruple lock because they want to keep the annual state pension permanently below the income tax threshold. And that's not by keeping the annual state pension low. That's by keeping the income tax threshold slightly higher for older people. There were big spending commitments as well, though.
We want to make life easier for people at every stage of their lives. So we'll also give working parents 30 hours of free childcare a week from when their child is 9 months to when they start school. We'll make child benefit fairer and simpler by moving to a household system that no longer penalises single-earner households and ensuring that any family that earns less than £120,000 a year will receive it.
So I'm actually very much in favour of those two policies. I think 30 hours a week for everyone from 9 months to primary school, brilliant. We need to really help people who are having kids. No one wants to have kids anymore. And I think that's partly because it's so goddamn expensive to do it. So good policy. Not that I, of course, trust the Conservatives to do it well. Sunak also said defence spending will go up to 2.5% of GDP. And there was also a vague promise of an annual real terms NHS budget increase. And Sunak also committed to 100,000 new apprenticeships and, as you know, a national service for 18-year-olds. So where would the money for those new schemes and tax cuts come from?
So today's plans, and you would expect nothing less from Jeremy and me, are fully funded. We will pay for permanent reductions in taxation by controlling the unsustainable rise in working age welfare that has taken off since the pandemic. In this party, we believe that it is morally right that those who can work do work, and that hard work is rewarded with people being able to keep more of their own money. So we will ensure that we have lower welfare so that we can deliver lower taxes.
So that's a very traditional Conservative message. Hey, we're going to cut taxes and we're going to pay for it by cutting benefits, essentially. I mean, you've heard this all before. Of course, the real question is whether those sums add up. Alongside their manifesto, the Tories released their costings document. It's just 4 pages long, but it does make for interesting reading. Over 5 years, the Tories have pledged £17 billion of tax cuts. That's the figure on the far right on the top row, as you can see. They've said they'll pay for it by making 18 billion pounds of savings. That's the figure in the second row, which they've sort of called welfare and tax gap, somewhat confusingly. According to Tory costings, 6 of those 18 billion pounds will come from tackling tax evasion over the next 5 years. Though you wonder why they haven't done that already. The Tories do, though, say they'll get the biggest number, £12 billion, by reforming the welfare system, so i.e. lots more cuts. To put that in context, £12 billion represents about 15% of state spending on universal credit last year. So that could be a lot of people either getting thrown off benefits or having their benefits frozen. I don't know how that's going to work out. I mean, it's not going to work out because the Tories aren't going to get elected. The reforms the Tories are planning to make to achieve those big savings, so they have spelled it out to some degree. I still think it's somewhat ambiguous. They say, proposed welfare reforms, reforming the disability benefit system to halt the unsustainable rise in claims, tightening up how the benefit systems assesses capability for work, overhauling the fit note process so that people are not being signed off sick as a default, and introducing tougher sanctions so people who refuse to take up suitable jobs after 12 months on benefits can have their cases closed and their benefits removed entirely. So somewhat ominous. This framing sort of suggests that people on benefits have had a really positive 14 years and we need to clamp down on them, which I don't think will be many people's experience of 14 years of Conservative government. James, is this a very traditional boilerplate Conservative manifesto? You know, we'll have some tax cuts and we'll pay for them by cutting some benefits. I mean, is that all there is to it? Could we have heard this, I suppose, 100 times before?
There doesn't seem to be very much else in there other than the sort of the sort of extremity of what's being proposed. Really, the scale of the cuts, if they come anywhere near, they were not going to win, so presumably it's not going to happen. But the scale of what they're proposing to implement in order to pay for these tax cuts, and the manner in which they say they're going to do it, is, yes, traditional conservatism. But you're dealing with a situation now where, look, if there's been an increase in long-term sick since the COVID pandemic, it's because a lot more people are sick since the COVID pandemic. Long COVID, the after effects of the shock of lockdowns, the disruptions to health systems. This isn't just Britain, by the way. This has happened right the way around the world. You can see the similar sort of pattern happening. If it costs more to run the NHS, it's because we have an older population, and as you get older, you're kind of more likely to end up sick and needing the NHS and needing care. It's really hard to cut these. It's always hard and cruel to cut these things. It gets more and more implausible to do it when you know that actually what's lying underneath this isn't like a mass outbreak of sponging that you can just sort of get rid of by encouraging a few people into work. Is that people are ill, and they're ill for actual real reasons, and you're not just going to be able to shift that by saying, oh, here's a number, it says 18 billion, 16 billion, whatever your magic number is at the end of 5 years. So it's a kind of boilerplate standard Tory manifesto, very crudely going like, oh, you're probably going to vote for us, here's a bit of a nudge, you won't vote for us, so whatever. But under these circumstances, it looks downright irresponsible to start to try and talk about these sort of savings being made.
Irresponsible, I don't believe it. Although that is Keir Starmer's line. Let's go to his reaction. This was Keir Starmer speaking just before the launch.
This is coming from the party that's put tax to the highest level since, for 70 years. And they're building this sort of Jeremy Corbyn-style manifesto where anything you want can go in it. None of it is costed. It's a recipe for more of the same. And that's why this choice of turn our back on this, turn the page and rebuild with Labour is so important. Got 6 first steps. We're ready to go on July the 5th.
That's an interesting strategy. Of course, Keir Starmer stood on a Jeremy Corbyn manifesto twice. Then in 2020, when he ran for the Labour leadership, Starmer called the 2017 Corbyn manifesto a foundational document that should not be trashed. Now he's saying Corbyn manifestos are the sort of characteristic, true example of irresponsibility. I actually have to go to you on this one, James, because Keir Starmer's calling the 2017 manifesto a sort of made-up, uncosted wish list. I know you're involved in that. You're probably going to take this personally.
Well, it's complete nonsense, isn't it? And dishonest to a very significant extent. He knows full well what was in the manifesto because he was elected on it. He knows full well the costing documents that were produced alongside that. Of course, it was fully costed. 2019, by the way, was also fully costed in terms of the manifesto document. There were then some promises made during the campaign which weren't costed in that sense. So it's kind of it's like, I know politically why he's doing this. I know that the strategy is to always, for 4 years, everything we do is not 5 years. Everything we do is not Jeremy Corbyn. That's what we have to do all the time. And it becomes a kind of the only sort of consistency you have after a period. And there's also this business of, oh, we're drawing a hard line. This is the end of the chaos of the 2010s. This is now going to be a new kind of government and its stability, and stability has changed, and all the other sort of slightly nonsensical things there. But it's basically dishonest. Like, it is simply not true to say that these manifestos were not fully costed. And for Starmer to be saying that is to retail the kind of lies he spent a few weeks accusing the Tories of making over their own tax claims on Labour's behalf.
Let's go to another Labour politician. This is Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves giving her response to the Conservative manifesto.
Over the last 4.5 hours, we have gone through the Conservative manifesto line by line. They claim that their plans are fully costed and fully funded. The analysis that we have conducted since publication has identified £71 billion of unfunded commitments over the course of the next Parliament. The consequence of an increase in day-to-day borrowing to fund the commitments made in this manifesto would amount to a second Tory mortgage bombshell, because higher borrowing at this scale would force the Bank of England to increase interest rates. The result would be an increase in the average mortgage totalling £4,800 over the course of the Parliament. This is serious.
This is serious. James, Rachel Reeves there, essentially saying this is the mini budget all over again. This is loads of unfunded promises. It's going to increase your interest rates. It's going to increase your mortgage costs. This is, as she says, this is very serious. How seriously should we take these kind of sums? We've had the Tories sort of throw at Labour, you're going to cost every family £2,000. Now Rachel Reeves says, I've gone away for 4.5 hours and we've worked out that, they're going to cost you even more. Is there normal? You've been part of this process, presumably. To what extent are people really crossing the I's and no, you cross the T's and dot the I's and cross the T's. To what extent are they doing that? And to what extent are they sort of saying, if we just come up with a number and say it in a dramatic tone of voice, then some people might believe it?
Oh, the performance is what matters with these things, and mostly what happens with how economics tends to get presented in Britain, and this is the fault of the sort of political journalists in particular for a good number of years. That somebody who is serious about economics is a sort of conservative, and they say things, and that's just serious, even though often it's just rubbish in loads and loads of different directions. I mean, this is one of the reasons we ended up austerity, economic nonsense for such a long period of time. And Rachel Reeves has got herself into that position where she's a former Bank of England economist, and therefore what she says is serious. It doesn't matter how serious it is, really. They've cobbled together this document. Fair play to people beavering away trying to make this happen. Ed Conway, the Sky economics correspondent, has done quite a public service in going through the Labour corrections to the costings document from the Tories and pointing out there are a number of sort of what appear to be mistakes in there, and perhaps more seriously, a load of assumptions about what will happen in the future that probably don't make very much actual economic sense. So that's kind of where we got to with this. It would be better. It would be a lot better for the standard of political debate in this country if we actually had a debate over policy and some slightly more realistic sense of what those policies might achieve, rather than both parties producing sums that they've decided to cook up, both of which results in it's a big scary number. We can't really do anything because of this big scary number, none of which gets into the actual detail of what it is that the party is actually going to do. It's bad for the Tories to talk about cutting in a huge way benefits paid to people who are sick. That's the line that Labour should be taking. That's the argument we should be having, not, well, we've looked at these numbers and made them look a bit more scary with our assumptions about them. PS made some mistakes ourselves and come to £71 billion is a kind of fictional figure, really, that you can cook up like this. It's not a serious policy debate. It's not getting into the politics of what the Tories are proposing, and it's not really contributing very much to the standard of what has basically been a miserable general election campaign from the point of view of actually generating any useful discussion about what the next government is really going to do.
I like the idea of sort of this floating, rather wonky voter who hasn't decided whether they'll vote Labour or Tory, but goes through all of the manifestos and does their own sums and say, actually, I make it out that the Labour manifesto is uncosted by £50 billion and the Tory manifesto is uncosted by £40 billion. So therefore, as a sensible technocrat, floating voter, I shall vote for the Conservatives. I'm not sure that's going to swing many seats. Although you can see why they're saying we're the party that won't spend money, because they think that anyone who cares about disability benefits is going to vote for Labour anyway, and the people who don't vote Labour are the people who are worried that they're going to raise their taxes. So I can see why they put on the big scary voice, but I completely agree that it sort of leads to a very stupid level of political debate. Sort of on this topic of taxes, James, I want your opinion on one last thing, a suitably wonky issue. On this clip, Paul Johnson from the IFS is speaking about the Tories and tax.
It is worth saying that it is already the case that despite the high level of taxes overall, taxes on people on average earnings today are probably the lowest they've been in 50 years. And the proposals, if implemented, that the Conservatives have here will bring those taxes on people on average earnings down even further. So there's a big gap between what's happening in the economy as a whole. People on high incomes, companies are paying a lot more tax, but people on average earnings are not.
So that wasn't actually a perspective I'd heard before. That's why I thought it was worth playing. Because we always hear that, the tax take is the highest that it's been in 70 years. I think that's as a proportion of GDP, isn't it? But what Paul Johnson from the IFS is saying there is, actually, if you're a standard worker, you're paying a lower level of tax than in a very long time. And so the implication is that, the taxes that are being paid are, is it either in VAT or is it just taxes on the rich or taxes on corporations? I don't really get it. So how is it the case that we have the highest tax take, but workers are paying not much tax? And then also, to me, that sounds almost progressive. It sounds like the Tories have had a somewhat left-wing tax policy. Make it make sense for me.
Well, the first thing is, look, there's greater joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 100 good people turning up. And in the case of Paul Johnson, it's the IFS that has, for a very long period of time, with no real accountability for this, been the institution that's pushed austerity. It was the IFS who were there providing the supposedly wonky technocratic justification for austerity. It's the IFS more recently that had this rhetoric of takeaways and giveaways when talking about tax that has floated the issue of the so-called tax burden. So I'm very glad to hear Paul Johnson actually starting to talk about the distribution of taxes and where they're landing and how this thing is going. It is true that taxes have risen over the period of time overall whilst the Tories have been in power. This is driven by a number of things, most obvious of which are significant increases in the real costs of doing things like running the NHS, one, when there's a pandemic, and two, when everyone's getting older and sicker, and all the rest of it. There's just significant increases in costs over time that resulted in an increase in the tax burden. What we're not having, and perhaps Paul Johnson's going to start this debate, but what we're not having is a serious discussion about the distribution of where that ends up. Now, the balance of tax changes under the Conservatives has not been what you would normally call progressive. It has not landed in the way that rich people end up paying much, much more into the distance, and everybody else doesn't. The closest it's come to that is this business of fiscal drag, where so-called, where over time, as people are paid more, there's more of them just ending up in higher tax bands. So gradually you end up with people who are being paid more, mostly because inflation's gone up as well, but they're being paid more, and off you go, you're paying a higher rate of tax all of a sudden. So there's a kind of accidental version of minor progressivity built into the tax system because of that. The trouble is, it's again this problem of where's the discussion about this? It's not a serious thing to say the tax burden's high, we've got to cut taxes. What matters is who's paying the taxes. And by the way, PS, we're all talking about unfunded this and that. Well, look, to be honest with you, governments can borrow money, and quite often governments should borrow money. And we need to have a bit more of a discussion about what government borrowing should be used for. Like, should it be used to build lots of new hospitals, to invest in railways, to build the stuff that we need for the future? Or is it all just one big panic about the big scary debt burden and how it has to be got rid of over time? We're not having that conversation at all in this election. You're getting a load of kind of flapping around, the various parties sort of flinging slightly weird spreadsheets at each other in the hope that presumably one of them will stick at some point with a very particular group of marginal voters at some, formerly marginal seats somewhere in the country. It's kind of desperate stuff. I mean, the whole campaign, has to be said, has been like this. And I'm not surprised that so many people are sort of switching off from it, and that turnout on the day, on July the 4th, isn't going to be so high.
Labour politicians have expended a lot of energy reassuring the general public that a Labour government won't mean they'll pay more tax, and to that end, they've ruled out an increase in income tax, national insurance or VAT. And they've also said they won't raise corporation tax. Now, this has left journalists to hunt for what other revenue-raising sources the party might be able to find, and the Financial Times has settled on this. They say Labour are sparking concern over a potential capital gains tax increase. Now, capital gains tax is what you pay when you sell an asset, so that's most commonly shares or a property. You pay the tax on the difference between the value of the asset when you bought it and the value of the asset when you sell it. So in other words, the profit you made on that investment. You don't sell it on your primary, or you don't get charged it on your primary residence in this country. Now, in the UK, capital gains tax is currently between 10 and 24%, which is well below the levels of income tax. And that leads to a criticism that our tax system rewards the wealthy, who are more likely to invest in assets at the expense of people who have to work for a living. And you might think that means raising capital gains tax would be a bloody good idea. But as the Financial Times says, a possible tax hike on capital gains has caused some people concern. Now, they include Brent Hoberman. He's the former chief executive of lastminute.com, which is the travel website. He called capital gains tax rises a populist trap and said this: if we have policies that are globally uncompetitive, it will cost us more and the country will have to find other ways to pay for the NHS, etc. Sir James Waits is also concerned. He's the chair of the Institute for Family Business, and he said this: the whole thing about capital gains tax is it becomes a disincentive to growth, and the Labour Party has said how important growth is. So presumably if you tax investments more, people will invest less. Andrew Jeffs is a partner at Cavendish, and they advise people selling their businesses. So that's a principal moment where one might have to pay capital gains tax if you sold your business. And he told the FT this: entrepreneurs are hard to get. If they're not happy to pay the amount of tax, they will do something else. And there is a whole industry to support them doing that. And there's something else I think is particularly go to a different country. I'll ask James in one moment who wins and who loses from capital gains tax, whether or not increasing it is a good idea. First, though, let's try and get to the bottom of whether Labour will actually hike them. Wes Streeting attempted to clarify the party's position on the BBC Today.
We've heard from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, haven't we? They've criticised both you and the Conservatives for your unwillingness to consider tax increases to raise the extra money that would be needed for any new government. You say you're not putting up corporation tax and VAT, but can you make the same guarantee for capital gains tax here on this programme now?
I can certainly confirm, our manifesto's out on Thursday, I can certainly confirm that not a single policy in that manifesto requires Labour to increase capital gains tax. And the reason we've set out our triple lock on income tax, national insurance and VAT is we wanted to send a really strong message to working people who've been absolutely clobbered by the Conservatives, who've used those taxes as their first and last resort, always picking the pockets of working people, always pleading poverty on behalf of the wealthier who Labour are going to ask to pay a bit more to fund our policies. We want to give working people that assurance that Labour is not going to increase those taxes because we know people can't afford it.
So there's a very interesting sort of formulation there. Wes Streeting said that Labour's manifesto commitments wouldn't require an increase in capital gains tax. So we can assume an increase in capital gains tax won't be in the manifesto. But he didn't rule out introducing them in government. So Labour have said, we will not only will it not be in the manifesto, but when we're in government, we will not increase VAT, we will not increase income taxes, and we will not increase national insurance. But when it comes to capital gains, he's just saying, well, we won't need to put it in the manifesto. He kind of then went on to very subtly defend taxing the rich and sort of oppose taxing working people. James, what's going on here? Do you sort of share my interpretation that Labour don't want to rule out raising capital gains tax because when they get into government, they think that they probably will do?
Yeah, I mean, look, the basic plan for Labour at the minute is to leave itself as much freedom of manoeuvre as possible for when they get into government. They know that they're going to arrive with a thumping great majority, and they don't want their hands tied on a whole load of different issues. The report, I think in The Guardian, wasn't it, last week, that Rachel Reeves, from somebody inside the Labour camp, that Rachel Reeves is planning to kitchen sink the budget. In other words, throw everything at it and say, look, there's all these terrible unfunded commitments. Everything's much worse than we thought. Our first budget will have to be some sort of emergency situation to deal with all of this. And that could, at this point, given that they're not ruling it out, could include tax rises like CGT. I mean, they really ought to do this. It is ridiculous that if you go to work, you pay tax 20%, 40%, depending on which band you're in. But if you're selling, I don't know, an antique that you've bought and you manage to sell it at a profit, you can end up paying just 10% on disposal of that. It's absolutely absurd how this thing plays out, and it's completely and obviously unfair. It's so unfair that Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor Nigel Lawson in 1986 decided to equalise the two things, because it's obviously unfair. If you look at who pays CGT, 45% of the revenue you get from capital gains taxes comes from people with gains of over £5 million. That's about 1% of everybody who pays CGT. So it's completely skewed towards, as you might have guessed, very wealthy people who have large numbers of assets, valuable assets they want to dispose of at a profit. That doesn't include pretty well all of us for most of our lives and most of the time. So you should definitely do it. And it's quite tempting for Labour to go in for that. All this stuff from various sort of special interests representing various bits of business saying, oh, well, it will clamp entrepreneurship and this sort of thing. It's not a tax on entrepreneurs as such. It's a tax on business owners at best and asset owners in general. And it's quite fair to tax these at the same rate. Why would you not do that as somebody who has to work? So in terms of what Labour is likely to do, I think this is going to be, and we're only a few days before, so let's see, but it's going to be a fairly minimal manifesto that leaves them with as much room as possible for manoeuvre once they arrive in government. And it's at least on the cards that they do something like, oh, we've opened the books and everything is much worse than we thought. And here, once we've got the majority, having won the elections, a bit of authority for us to do that, here are some tax rises to try and pay for that. I suspect they might also do something around the Bank of England mandate, because that looks like a bit of free money as well. But that's how this is landing. Now, again, to return to a theme, what this means is that you're not really having much of a debate about how the country should be governed for the next 5 years, because you've got a party saying, well, we've got no plans. We've got no plans to do this, but who knows what happens once you're in power. It doesn't make for a good public debate. It sets yourself up, by the way, if you are a government and you haven't been clear about what you're going to do, for potential trouble somewhere down the line, because people can turn around and go, you didn't say this was going to happen. You didn't say you were going to do this. You didn't tell us about any of this stuff beforehand. And that's where your legitimacy starts to look a bit shaky.
So just to get this clear in my head, so the capital gains tax, I can clearly see why it's completely unfair to say that if you get taxed more for working than you do for owning assets. But I presume the argument sort of to keep it low is to say, look, I know it's unfair to keep it low, but assets are more, people can move assets in a way that they can't move people. So if you're a working person, you can't say, well, taxes have gone up to 41%, so I'm not going to go to work anymore. But for capital gains tax, if capital gains tax goes up to 40%, then people who own assets might say, well, then I'll move them abroad. Am I on the right track? So sort of like the argument to say, keep it this way is, yes, it's unfair, but sometimes you've got to be unfair because wealthy people have power to move their wealth.
Well, it's quite hard to move your third, fourth, fifth property as a landlord abroad, right? This is not something. There's a great, not a large number of assets you can't actually move. Yeah, they kind of stuck to the ground. You can't move it somewhere else, and if you did, it's worth less. So, hey, no capital gain, I suppose. That's one part of it. The other part is, look, you have to treat this as part of how you're going to try and get the economy working better than it did. We have something, it's not even a cottage industry, it's quite a substantial industry that has built up around chasing financial gains and making capital gains in particular, at the expense of longer term investment in things that people might actually need. Now, if you start to rinse some of that out of the system, overall, this is a good thing. Overall, it is better to not have people chasing speculative capital gains and rather making longer-term holdings of various assets. If you're a business owner, for instance, you want to have a long-term commitment to the asset that you're holding, not a short-term juicy asset, get the return up as high as possible, sell it as quickly as possible. I mean, a weird quirk of fate is, by the way, this whole disequalization of the two rates came about because Labour, way back in the late 1990s, tried to address that problem of people disposing assets too quickly. So they wanted to build in incentives to hold on to them by cutting the rate of capital gains tax. This went hilariously off the rails and has basically turned into this system where CGT is really low for everyone. Doesn't matter how long you hold on to an asset, no incentives there. You just sell it whenever you get the lower tax rate, and everybody else has to pay a much higher rate. So there's a problem with the financial system, with the economy that's built into this, that we have these things not working really in the best interest of most people. And actually, again, if Labour was a bit more serious about doing something about this, you wouldn't just pat the financial system on the head, say, hey, we're not actually going to do anything serious for you people, and then try and get on with doing whatever else you want to do over here. You'd address this as one of the things you need to address to actually make the British economy work for most of the people who live here.
Maybe they're saving this all for after the election, and then she'll do it in a very, Rachel Lee's in a very stern voice. So we've opened the books. It's all completely disastrous. We need these 12 new taxes. I mean, it's probably not going to be a memorable headline grabber, but I suppose they don't want it to be a memorable headline grabber because the idea is they're going to say we're going to do a bunch of stealth taxes that you might not notice. Maybe. If you're enjoying our general election coverage, do think about supporting us. You can do that at novaramedia.com/support. The link, as ever, is in the description. If you already are a financial supporter to Novara Media, thank you so much. We really do appreciate it. It makes all of this possible. The United Nations Security Council has adopted a resolution supporting a Gaza ceasefire deal outlined by US President Joe Biden. It's the first time the Security Council has endorsed a peace plan since Israel began its assault on the enclave in October, and all but one of the 15 members of the Council voted in favour of the plan, with Russia abstaining. The plan for peace, as it's called, involves 3 phases. The first phase involves the following steps, and they're supposed to take place over 6 weeks. So you've got an immediate, full and complete ceasefire with the release of hostages, including women, then elderly and the wounded, return of the remains of some killed hostages, exchange of Palestinian prisoners, withdrawal of Israeli forces from the populated areas in Gaza, return of Palestinian civilians to their homes, safe and effective distribution of humanitarian aid throughout Gaza. If that takes longer than 6 weeks to achieve, then the ceasefire will continue as long as negotiations are still ongoing. And when those conditions are achieved, phase 2 and then 3 will kick in. So phase 2 is a permanent end to hostilities in exchange for the release of all other hostages still in Gaza and a full withdrawal of Israeli forces from the area. And phase 3 is the start of a major multi-year reconstruction plan for Gaza and the return of the remains of any deceased hostages still in the Strip to their families. The text of the resolution also explicitly rejects any territorial or demographic changes to Gaza. So in other words, no ethnic cleansing, no settlers, and no land grabs by Israel. But the resolution also contained another piece of wording, one that explicitly called on Hamas but not Israel to accept the deal. Here's how US Ambassador to the UN Linda Thomas-Greenfield presented the resolution to the Council.
We're waiting on Hamas to agree to the ceasefire deal it claims to want. But we cannot afford to wait and wait and wait. With every passing day, needless suffering continues. Israel accepted this deal because it ensures its security. As President Biden made clear, Hamas is no longer capable of carrying out another October 7th, and the United States' commitment to Israel's self-defense is ironclad.
Now, that's a slightly strange framing, right? That Israel has accepted the deal and it's only Hamas that's standing in the way of peace. If that were the case, what's everyone doing in all of these ceasefire demonstrations, right? And it's a framing that was repeated by other US officials in the run-up to the UN vote. This was National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan speaking to CNN at the weekend.
The best way to end this war is for Hamas to say yes to the deal President Biden announced and that Israel has accepted, which lays out a roadmap to an enduring ceasefire and the return of all hostages. That's what we are driving for, and that's what we're asking the world to call upon Hamas to accept.
Again, Israel has accepted the ceasefire. All we need to do is put more pressure on Hamas. If only everyone were to sort of say, we condemn Hamas and they must accept this ceasefire, then they would do it. That's the framing from the United States. And it's, again, repeated by the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, speaking in Tel Aviv after the UN vote.
Everyone has said yes, except for Hamas. And if Hamas doesn't say yes, then this is clearly on them.
So the framing, the claims from the United States is that Israel wants peace and Hamas is the only thing blocking it. However, it's very far from clear that that's in any way the case. So Netanyahu has not publicly said he accepts the deal as it's been presented by Joe Biden. Obviously, he says there is a deal he'd accept, but he hasn't said it's this one. In contrast, a Hamas official has confirmed that the group does accept the ceasefire plan as it's laid out in the UN resolution. So Hamas have said publicly they accept it. Netanyahu hasn't. Confusingly, Qatari and Egyptian mediators say they have not received a formal reply to the UN-backed proposal from either Israel or Hamas. So neither of the parties have sort of said, we accept this document, in writing to the negotiators. Hamas have said it sort of in public. What's clear, though, is that in the Israeli government, there is no consensus whatsoever surrounding any ceasefire plan. Just yesterday, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich entered into a shouting match with families of hostages, telling them Israel would not commit collective suicide. And by collective suicide, Smotrich was referring to any deal that included the release of Hamas militants who, he says, have blood on their hands. And 2 days after the resignation of Benny Gantz from Netanyahu's war cabinet, the likes of Smotrich now have even more power than ever. As for the official Israeli government position, a spokesperson has said this: Israel will not end the war before achieving all its goals, eliminating Hamas's military and civil capabilities, returning all of our hostages, and ensuring that Gaza never again represents a threat to Israel. The proposal that was presented allows Israel to meet these conditions, and it will do so. What is going on here? You've got the Americans saying Israel have accepted this, Hamas need to accept it. The Israelis sort of publicly saying, well, Netanyahu not saying anything, parts of the government actively denouncing it. To me, it seems like, the reason neither party potentially has formally replied, formally said to the negotiators, we will sign this deal, is because both of them want guarantees or the lack of it. So I think Hamas wants some kind of guarantee that this permanent ceasefire will be supported by the international community, because they don't want Israel to get back the hostages and then go on to continue bombing Gaza and destroying, their organization. Now, whether or not you like the organization, they don't want to be destroyed. So it's going to be unlikely to sign a document which sort of creates their complete destruction. And Israel seems to want to continue with the war, right? So Netanyahu keeps saying, yes, we'll have a ceasefire, but then we will continue to do everything in our power to completely obliterate Hamas. And I mean, this statement from the Israeli government spokesperson, I think, is particularly chilling in a way, because he says they will not end the war by achieving all of its goals. And then this is the one that really sticks out to me, and ensuring that Gaza never again represents a threat to Israel. Now, he's not even saying Hamas never again represents a threat to Israel, that Gaza never again represents a threat to Israel. Now, to me, that would be the end of a peace deal. Right? If there were a full-blown peace agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis, then you could say that an outcome of that, obviously, there's no point in a peace deal if the two countries at that point are a constant threat to each other. But Gaza is going to remain in conflict with Israel until there is a peace deal. And if they're saying they're ensuring that Gaza never again represents a threat to Israel, I mean, the only way you can do that is by completely destroying Gaza. You can't really. We, as Britain, we can't ensure that France will never again represent. The only way to 100% ensure that someone is not going to threaten you in the future is to destroy them. So that does still seem to be the logic coming from the Israeli side. And then you've got the Americans saying the Israelis want peace if only Hamas agreed to it. Well, the Israelis will only agree to something which means that Gaza can never again, in any hypothetical situation, represent a threat to Israel, despite the fact that Israel has the region under blockade. Of course, while these endless negotiations drag on, Israeli airstrikes continue to hit Gaza's population. Footage verified by Al Jazeera shows an airstrike hitting just meters away from the tents of displaced Palestinians in Bar az-Zawaida in central Gaza. So far, more than 37,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. More than 15,000 of the dead are children. Rishi Sunak has given an half-hour election interview to the BBC. It wasn't incredibly interesting. I watched it all. I'm not going to show you that much of it. It did end, though, with this rather telling question.
I want to close by asking you whether you really think the Conservatives deserve another 5 years in power. Many viewers have told us, they've got in touch with the BBC and says, nothing works in this country. You can't get a GP appointment. You can't get to dentist. You can't afford somewhere to live. The trains don't run on time. Sewage get pumped into the rivers and the sea. Why do you deserve another chance?
Well, we haven't got time to go over all the things of the last 14 years. I point out one thing which you failed to mention on your list. Thanks to the Conservative education reforms, our children in this country are not just the best readers in the UK, they're the best readers in the Western world. We've transformed possibilities for young people because of our education reforms, but this election is about the future. And we have been through a tough few years, that's undeniable, but I believe we've turned the corner now. And this election is about building on the progress that we've made, delivering a secure future for everyone, where their taxes are cut, their pensions are protected, migration is coming down, and we get to net zero in a more sensible way. That's what I offer at this election. I'm prepared to take bold action. I've got a clear plan to deliver that. And in contrast, Labour Party are asking for a blank cheque. They won't tell you what they're going to spend it on, and they won't tell you which of your taxes are going to go up to pay for it. And that is the choice at this election.
After 14 years, 5 prime ministers, Boris Johnson lying about parties, Liz Truss almost crashing the economy, and you bunking off D-Day, after all the broken promises, you really think you deserve another chance?
I've been very clear in the past, no government gets everything right, but I am proud of what has been achieved over 14 years. This election is also about the future. We have a clear plan. I'm prepared to take bold action to cut people's taxes, protect their pensions, and bring migration down. And in contrast, Labour are just going to put everyone's taxes up. That's a choice.
This election is not about the future, right? If you have been, I mean, in most areas of life, right, the best way you can predict the future is by looking at the past. If someone is constantly rude to you and swears at you whenever they see you, they're probably going to do that in the future. If whenever you ask someone to do something, they don't do it, probably in the future they also won't do it when you ask them. Right? This is sort of it's the law of inference, actually. And this is also how electorates behave, and they're quite right to. Right? If you're an electorate, you're trying to judge a government. You're saying, do we want them to continue their job? Now, you don't say, okay, they've been a complete disaster for 14 years, but maybe they'll change. Maybe they'll change. Isn't that, whose definition of madness was it? I'll have to look this up. Someone's definition of madness, someone very famous, you'll all know it in the comments, said the definition of madness is to keep doing the same thing and expecting there to be a different result. Why would we, as the British public, say, well, maybe this time when we vote Conservative, it's all going to be okay? So it's not a very strong position to fight an election from. And Nick Robinson, to be fair to him, his question there was pretty spot on. And I do think that exchange explains why the Tories are doing quite so terribly in this election. And in fact, as a number of commentators have now said, what we're living through is barely an election and more a punishment beating. And however out of touch they might seem, this is something the Tories do seem to understand. There are not many things they understand. This is one of them. And so their campaign strategy has taken an interesting turn. This is a new advert the Conservatives are pushing out on Facebook.
Keir Starmer needs you. He's had 4 years to tell you his plan. Has he got one? Or is he hiding it from you? The more votes for Reform, the Liberal Democrats or anyone else will hand Labour 100 extra seats, giving Keir Starmer the largest majority Labour have ever had. With Reform still winning no seats at all, with the Lib Dems on board with everything Keir Starmer wants to do, a vote for Reform or the Lib Dems means you'll have no one holding Keir Starmer to account on your behalf. This means you'll be handing him a blank cheque to spend on anything he wants with no control over what it'll cost you. Are you sure that's what you want to vote for? More taxes and borrowing? Leaving our children with more debt? More of your money going to benefits while you and your family go to work? Don't risk it. Vote Conservative.
I was looking at the quote. Apparently, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. That was usually ascribed to Einstein. The Tory advert that they're pushing out, a vote for Reform, or you must vote for Reform or the Lib Dems, because otherwise there'll be no one holding Starmer to account on your behalf. So essentially, James, the Tories seem to have accepted that they are going to lose this election. They're saying, do you want Keir Starmer to have an opposition in Parliament? Then vote Conservative. Very strange thing for an incumbent party to be saying.
Strange thing for an incumbent party, strange thing for, what is often described as the most successful party in the Western world in the last sort of 200 years or so. They governed this country for most of that period of time. It's quite a moment for them to be dragged to something like this. But I think they realise, because how could you not realise that from the off in this election, they were on the back foot. Presumably Rishi Sunak called it on the grounds that the economic news wasn't really going to get any better from this point onwards. It still looks like a mad decision, and I know there's a lot of his own colleagues certainly feel the same, possibly soon to be ex-colleagues, certainly feel similarly about that. But they knew that they were in a bad place from this point. And their campaign has, if it's targeted anything at all, has been going at whatever is left of their core vote, and you just chase and chase and chase after that. National Service stuff did nothing other. Nothing other for anybody, on paper, a serious proposal. By the way, there's quite a sinister, if you actually look seriously at what they're proposing, let's create every year an army of 30,000 volunteers schooled in British values. Seems a little bit like, hang on, that's something else than national service. But it's there to appeal to the core vote. Same thing with the pensions, as you talked about. Same thing now with the big handout the tax cut for the self-employed. By the way, the self-employed aren't really a core Tory vote anymore and haven't been for some period of time. That's fairly obvious. But nonetheless, this is where they're going with this. It's a core vote strategy. I remember Ed Miliband described in 2015 as having a 35% strategy. That's what they needed to get to win. The Tories have something more like a 30% strategy. On current polling, which I know we're going to get onto, they'll be lucky to get even that.
We're going to look at a YouGov poll. It dropped late this afternoon. Pretty dramatic, really. The Labour Party on 38%, so they've been up. That's actually lower than they have been in a while, but still very much a comfortable lead. The big one, though, the Conservatives on 18%, down 1. Reform on 17%, so up 1. So Reform 1 point away from the Conservatives, and the Conservatives so far down on 18 for a governing party. Also of interest there, the Lib Dems are up 4 on 15, so they're doing quite well. And potentially that's because this field work. So when they asked people who they wanted to vote for, the Lib Dems were in the news a lot because of their manifesto. Might also be because people think that Ed Davey looks like a kind of fun guy when he's always falling into the water. And he did do that very moving video, really, about his son and his mother and sort of caring for them. And then the Greens on 8%, up 1. James, though, it's that sort of closeness, the Conservatives and Reform, that's really going to terrify Rishi Sunak. I think YouGov has them sort of closer than other polls. If we'd be in a completely different situation, if all the polls were showing Reform above the Conservatives, then who could guess what would happen? But this is already scary enough for the Tories, isn't it?
Scary enough for Tories, and something that, as we saw Nigel Farage openly sort of saying he wants to see happen. This is their target, that they want to overtake the Conservatives. It's our own sort of crappy British version of the Italian sorpasso. This moment in the 1970s when the Communist Party was going to overtake the Christian Democrats, the Italian Conservative Party, if you like. It never quite happened. But yeah, we got a version of that. Will Reform, these brave upstarts, overtake the most successful party in the Western world for the vote? Look, as you said, it's not really matched by the other pollsters out there. It's also not kind of matched by a sort of gut feeling on this, which is that just how the electoral system works and how people adapt their votes because of how the electoral system works. And the Tories pushing a message that, you really do need to vote Conservative, stop Labour. You think that's going to get squeezed. Certainly, if we do end up with anything like that, the results will go wild if you put this into a first past the post system. I mean, it sort of really starts to distort who gets what representation in Parliament. Reform aren't going to get 18% or anything like the number of MPs, and who knows where various Tory MPs will go to and which Tory seats will switch in which direction from that. So it could be incredibly chaotic underneath the big headline of Labour winning. But as I said, I'm slightly sceptical about the complete Tory wipeout kind of scenario that we might be looking at here.
Normally, at this sort of stage in the election, you would expect to start to see sort of a closing of the polls between the two main parties, because people do begin to recognise, oh, okay, we live in a two-party system. If we want to keep out the other guys, we're going to have to vote for, the people who we're less scared of. And I suppose Keir Starmer and the people around him would say their big achievement in this election and over the past 4 years is that doesn't seem to really be happening. There aren't many people, it seems. The Tories are trying to increase the number of people like this, but it doesn't seem like there are many people who are saying, look, I hate Rishi Sunak, but I'm not going to waste my vote on reform because I'm too terrified about that extremist Keir Starmer becoming Prime Minister. We can't read people's minds. Maybe things will change. But at the moment, it doesn't seem like there are going to be that many people driven to the polls because they're terrified of Keir Starmer. And obviously, whatever you thought about him, I think he had some great policies. Many people did go to the polls because they were scared of Jeremy Corbyn.
And they went to the polls because they wanted to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, look, turnout was up in the last couple of elections. Turnout was well up for the Brexit referendum. And this was like one of the all-time highs in terms of national polls of any description for a long period of time. And basically, turnout fell off a cliff after 1997 and has barely recovered in the last few elections. What I think is going to happen this time round, and this, by the way, also accounts for some of the volatility in the polling, is that there are very large numbers of people who are still saying don't know, haven't decided, won't vote, and the various pollsters don't entirely know what to do with them. So you get, beneath the headline of Labour's doing well, you get a lot of churn amongst all the other parties as different pollsters apply different methods to working out what to do with a whole bunch of people who are so disaffected they don't want to vote. And I would be astonished if turnout gets anything like as high as we saw in the last couple of general elections.
Yeah, turnout will be very interesting at this one. I'd always imagined the 1997 election as having high turnout, but it was actually a lot lower than 1992. Tony Blair was a lot more popular than Keir Starmer. He was about plus 20 in the rankings, whereas Starmer is minus 20. So to be this far ahead in the polls while no one really likes you that much is interesting. Let's wrap up there. James Meadway, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
No problem at all. Always a pleasure to be here, Michael.
We should do this more often. It's been a joy seeing you twice in 5 days. Thank you everyone for watching. Always lovely to see you too. We'll see you tomorrow. I'll be back for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.